Hi guys, welcome to this very, very special Interact Salon with James Clear. I don't think I've had any other author mentioned with the "oh, he changed my life" epithet so many times. So I'm so curious to hear from you how you got there and also just hear the stories in the room. For those of you who have never been to an Interact SuperSalon, this is a salon with an extra. We have Nestle's Anne-Laure Le Cunff here, who will be running the event, and James is our beloved special guest. This is recorded, will be uploaded on our YouTube, and you can send it to your mom, if she's complaining about anything, that you did this, you've listened to this, you've read this. We'll be talking obviously about atomic habits and more. If you wish to speak, if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand. You can also share questions in the chat. Of course, there is this risk there that, Anne-Laure might miss something if there's a lot of conversation going on there. We will save the Zoom chat. So, if you're sharing the best ever essay you've ever written there or your favorite links, it will be saved. What else? There will be multiple stops where we will take questions, so everybody will be heard. Please switch on your camera if you can, so we have a more living roomy vibe. Hi. And after that, so we have a hard stop in around 85 minutes. And after that, I will be hosting an after party on the Interact Discord in the II Cafe. So if, whatever you couldn't touch upon during this conversation, you will get a chance to do so there. And Anne-Laure, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Anna. I would also love to have people ask questions live, because that's the whole point of joining these things instead of watching the recording. So if at any point there's something that you'd like to ask directly to James, just use the function in Zoom. I think after those past 3 years, everyone is very familiar with how it works, but if not, it's at the bottom. You click on the little yellow hand, and I will take some breaks from the conversation with James and look through those and ask some people and give them the floor to ask their questions directly. So you feel free to do that. But yes, let's get started. So whether you've read his amazing book, Atomic Habits, or if you've subscribed to his newsletter, I think many of you have learned from James, have had their lives changed by his work. And I'm very, very excited to spend some time together for the next hour and a half, where we're going to be able to dig a little bit deeper into his work and hopefully learn a little bit about how we can build better habits, since it's the new year and that's a time where a lot of people are thinking about these things. So James, I usually start these conversations asking what's on your mind, but in your case, I want to ask you, what is currently on your habits scorecard? What's going on? What are the things that the habits you're trying to build, the ones you're trying to break? So yeah, tell us.
Yeah. Well, first, hey, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thanks for the chance to chat and talk about some of this stuff. It's fun, and Happy New Year. What's on my habits scorecard? I'm in this weird stage right now where I have young kids, and so I feel like my time is very compressed and I don't have as much capacity as I used to have before. So it's really like a returning to the fundamentals kind of season for me. It's not that I'm trying to really add anything new. It's like I'm trying to make sure that I remain consistent or get back on track with basic stuff like, did I get a shower today? Did I sleep enough? And also more fundamental stuff like, do I have a little bit of time to read each day? Am I carving out an hour to write and work on the book manuscript? Did I get a workout in? So it's really like pretty fundamental stuff, but all those things move the needle for me in like a really meaningful way. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now in terms of like time. And it's somewhat both cathartic and frustrating to have to like take my own medicine so much right now. Like I really need to scale it down and start small. That's just kind of the season that I'm in.
That's so interesting. I love that you're talking about seasons. And I think something that a lot of people have been through in the past couple of weeks. Oh, I'm sorry, by the way, everyone, if you could all mute yourself, that'd be amazing. Or maybe Anna, you can do that for them. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. I think, so I was rereading Atomic Habits recently in preparation for this. And something that was really interesting for me is to notice the difference between the younger me who read this pre-pandemic very hopeful, very, I just believe that if I applied the system, then everything would work. And then, my life and everyone's life was turned upside down. And something that you write in the book is that how a stable environment, how helpful that is when it comes to building good habits and break bad ones. So I feel like now as a new dad and with the pandemic and all of that, you've been able to really put your ideas to the test in the past few years. So can you talk a little bit about what it looks like to try and maintain habits in a very unstable, uncertain environment, one where you don't have a lot of control? How can you do that better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it also speaks to something that's important about how habits are formed that people don't usually discuss. So typically when people define what a habit is, if you were to talk to an academic or a researcher, they usually talk about behaviors that are like small and quick and automatic, like brushing your teeth or tying your shoes, like stuff that is pretty mindless. But a different way, perhaps a more useful way to define what a habit is that it's a behavior tied to a particular context. So your habit of watching Netflix at 7 p.m. is tied to the context of the couch in your living room, or your habit of journaling, each morning is tied to the context of the chair by your kitchen table. And these behaviors that we perform throughout life, they get linked to the places where they occur. And I think that that's actually one interesting thing you can do if you're trying to build a new habit is you can sort of keep it in the back of your mind and then walk into the rooms where you spend most of your time each day and just look around that space and ask yourself, what behavior is this space designed to encourage? What behaviors are obvious here? What behaviors are easy here? And are there little adjustments or tweaks that I can make to reduce the friction of doing and maybe increase the friction of the habits I don't want to perform? And the more that you optimize your environment or your space for that behavior, the easier it becomes to do it. Now, as you mentioned, we all went through this kind of weird global experiment for the last couple of years where our environment just got completely upended. And, it used to be that your pantry was miles away when you were at the office at work all day, but now you're working from your kitchen table and it's right around the corner and you can snack whenever you want, or it used to be that if you wanted to do a workout, you would pass the gym on your commute to work, but now you're working from home. And so where does that happen? And this kind of upending of context, this altering of context really altered a lot of our habits. And that I think is a pretty relatively universal truth about behavior, which is when the environment changes in a big way, behavior tends to change in a big way. If you take most people and put them on a beach, they feel pretty relaxed and calm and subdued. And if you put most people and put them in a war zone, they feel really stressed and anxious and nervous. And that's mostly a reaction to the environment or the context that you're in. So I think one of those big picture questions to ask yourself about your habits is, what context am I in each day? What environments have I created and cultivated? And how can I shape those in a way that better serves the habits that I want to perform? It's still going to take effort and energy, right? It's not going to be just like automatic and you'll never think about it. But you might as well stack the deck in your favor. You might as well optimize the environment to prime it to make it those good habits the path of least resistance. So I think there are a lot of connections between environment and context, and we all have probably felt that a little more acutely over the last 2 years, just because it's been so obvious and so extreme. But it's a force that's playing out and influencing your behavior all the time, whether you're in the middle of a pandemic or not.
Yeah, it's very interesting that a lot of people actually abandoned completely the idea of even trying to maintain their habits. In the past couple of years, there's been this whole trend of, I don't know if you've seen it, that going goblin mode, where you just watch Netflix, eat chocolate, and just completely let go, which had a place. I think at the time it was a coping mechanism for a lot of people, but now you hear a lot of people saying, like, I want to get back on track, I want to start taking care of myself again. So for all of these people who are so far from the never miss twice situation where you're just trying to tweak it and make it a little bit better, you're really starting from scratch again. Where would you start? And especially you've mentioned starting with the basics. Like, what would be the first step if for someone who feels like the new year right now is a good time to just start again, start afresh? Where would you start?
Okay, so first, just a point on the kind of mindset piece. I kind of have this little collection of like, I call them like mindset reframes, basically, that I try to keep this like running list. And one of the good ones I came across during the pandemic was that, and to your point about people going goblin mode or kind of using this as a chance for gluttony or to, like just kind of a big like blank check of excuses to sort of do whatever you feel like. A lot of that was a coping mechanism. It was kind of a response to this feeling of being trapped or feeling like you're in kind of this prison if you're in quarantine, or, you feel like you don't have any options. And I saw this little line that said, it's not a prison, it's a chrysalis. And I was like, oh, I love that idea of reframing, like this time where I'm not locked down. I can't do anything that I want. It's more like I'm going to go into my chrysalis and turn into something beautiful. How can I take this time and transform it into something that benefits me rather than something that hinders me? And that's just one example, applying it to this situation. But that skill of trying to reframe things to better serve you, I generally really like the question, something along the lines of, without ignoring the reality of the situation, without ignoring the truth of what needs to be done or what I need to deal with or the uncomfortable conversation I need to have, what is the most useful and empowering version of the facts that I can tell myself? Because if you're going to deal with reality still, I just can't see what telling yourself a less useful or less empowering version of the facts is going to get you. There's this interesting exercise I came across. I can't even remember where I first saw it, but the basic idea is you pick some time frame. Let's say it's a year, the last year of your life for this example. But it could be anything, 10 years, 6 months, whatever. And you have 2 sheets of paper. And on the first sheet of paper, you're going to write out the last year of your life, and you're going to write it in the least favorable way possible. The second sheet of paper, you're going to write it in the most favorable way possible. And the only rule of this little game is that there aren't allowed to be any lies on either paper. So you have to only say things that are factual. And, we all can think of ways to come up with the story of our life or the story of these events that either influence us in a positive way or in a negative way. And you're not lying to yourself. It's just, what do you choose to emphasize? What do you choose to focus on? And so I'm big on trying to like reframe things and focus on the piece that empowers you or is most useful. Anyway, so that's an aside. What was your original actual question?
I'll go back to my question, but I just want to add something to what you just said, because it just like connected 2 things in my mind I think are interesting. The whole idea of creative constraints when you're writing a story that writer use, you've used that yourself, right?
Yeah.
I love the idea of using that to write the story of your life and knowing that in that chapter, for example, you're going to be in lockdown at home. So that's the constraints. So what happens in that chapter with that constraint, basically, when you're writing that story of your life? And I really like that.
Constraints is huge, actually. Like sometimes I'll play this game with, usually I do it in like a business context, but you can do it with your life too. So after I wrote Atomic Habits, the habit that kind of launched my career was that I wrote a new article every Monday and Thursday, and I did that for 3 years. And then that helped grow the audience, and I got the book deal. And then I spent the next 3 years writing Atomic Habits, and then the book came out. And I maintained the newsletter throughout that, but I had to change it as I was writing the book because I just didn't have the capacity to write the words in the same way. The first 3 years when I was doing it, I was spending 20 plus hours on each article. I just didn't have the time to do it when I was working on the book. So after the book came out, I tried to step back, and I knew that I needed a different style of newsletter. I still wanted to send something every week, but I needed something that was more sustainable for the amount of time that I had. And rather than just be like, well, I'll just do a watered down version of what I was doing before, or I'll scale it back in some way, I tried to like seriously consider this question of if you were to map out all the universe of options of all the different things a newsletter could be, do I think there's one of them out there that I could do in like 1 or 2 hours a week that would not be as good as what I'm doing right now, but would actually be better, that like the readers would actually get more value out of, or more people would enjoy it, or it'd be more spreadable or whatever. And, there's a lot of things out there in the universe. Like, you got to think there's probably something that's better than what you're doing right now that could also still fit that creative constraint. And it took me about 8 months or so of like trying to come up with different ideas, but eventually I stumbled on 3-2-1, which is the format I use now. And whether it's better or not, I don't know. But my point is just that it's useful to try to impose those kind of constraints on yourself sometimes. And sometimes you don't get to choose the constraint. You know, like part of it was that's all the time I had. I just only had 2 hours a week. And so I needed to find something that could fit that because I knew that's what I could actually do consistently. And operating within that constraint doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome has to be worse. You could apply the same kind of thinking to your habits. You know, it's like, well, maybe you wish that you had 5 days a week for an hour that you could get into the gym, but the reality based on the kids you have or the job you have or whatever creative constraint that you're facing might be that you only get 3 days a week and you only have 20 minutes. So given that, how can you have the best possible workout in 20 minutes, 3 days a week? And trying to like not view your constraints as a hindrance, but just as something to like strategize within, I think that can be a helpful mindset to carry around too.
It's incredibly helpful. And something that's interesting here too is that, you know, a lot of people know you have millions of subscribers now. So a lot of people know the new format and maybe they haven't read the previous one. And maybe what they may not know is that it's not even your first newsletter. So you've made several changes throughout the course of your life and your career. You've experimented, you've tried new things. And I guess, you know, obviously today it's easy to look at the numbers and say that's success. James has been very successful in sharing his ideas, in helping people. In the past, when you were making those big changes, changing the newsletter, changing the format completely, or when you decided to kill a project and to switch to a different topic, how do you know it's working or whether you're making a big mistake when you're making that kind of change?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think this is something that I try to be good at practicing, which is reinventing myself or not being scared to try something totally new. And there is an element of it that's always scary because you have no idea if that, you know, right turn that you're taking is really that smart. I had plenty of false starts. I mean, the first 2 years of my career were me trying a bunch of different blogs and websites and business ideas that didn't work out. One of the best pieces of advice that I got early on was to try things until something comes easily. Now, if you think carefully about that statement, it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It just means that the results tend to come easier than the other projects that you're working on. So you have, I guess a different way we could phrase it is signals of progress come more quickly when you find the right thing to work on. And so I tried 4 or 5 different business projects over the first 2 years, and everything was just kind of okay. It wasn't really sticking. And you'll know when you hit something really that's like really on the nose because it just kind of takes off inside of your control. I mean, like Atomic Habits is not even, I couldn't stop it from selling now if I wanted to, you know, like I'm not in control of it anymore, which is sort of a weird place to be with a creative project, but like it's just taken off on its life, a life of its own. Now, early on, you're not going to see that kind of success, but you will get signals of progress. And most things that end pretty well tend to go at least decently well in the early stages. So I would say with jamesclear.com, which I've been writing there for a little over 10 years now, November was 10 years. I knew within a month that it was going better than the other stuff that I was working on. So it was still small and nobody really knew anything about it, but I just could tell the feedback was better from the readers. The email list was growing faster, even if it was still really tiny. It just was obvious that it was on a better trajectory. So I think you do need some level of persistence, some level of willingness to like not quit, but you also don't want to be an idiot about it and just bang your head against the wall and keep doing something that has no signals of progress. Most of the time, if you pick like a really big category where there's a lot of competition, like habits, you know, I'm not the first person to write about habits, you know, like I'm just adding my little piece to the puzzle. Like this is a topic that's been around for a very long time. It'll be around a long time after I'm gone. So it's a really big category. So you can kind of trust that the category is something people are interested in. What you need is to figure out, is my line of attack like right for me? Is the thing that I'm trying to share or the strategy I'm taking or the voice that I have, is it a good fit for that topic? Or do I need to try a different line of attack? And I feel like a lot of the time trying differently is almost more important than trying again. You know, the kind of the standard narrative about being consistent or being persistent is, hey, you got to keep trying. You need to keep hammering. You have to keep like pushing, you know, and eventually you'll break through. But Sort of. I mean, you do need to keep showing up each day, but a lot of the time you need to try just a different line of attack on the same thing. Like don't just keep doing the same exact thing over and over again and be like, well, I'll break through someday. It's like it requires some kind of experimentation within your vertical, and then you end up stumbling upon the angle that's right for you.
I love this. There's a quote from, I think it's Aldous Huxley, that says that the only completely consistent people are dead, something like that. So it's like, just like if you're always repeating the same thing without changing anything, you're not really alive, you're not really learning, you're not really growing. So yeah, I really
we could
like
probably
that.
summarize it with something like, you need to show up every, like a lot of people, and it is a very common problem that people don't get results, mostly because they're not consistent. It's kind of like, if you want to get in shape, it's like, well, don't miss a workout for 2 years and then get back to me. Like that's kind of, but most people won't do that. And so you never get to the point where if it was going to work or not. But I think there is some element of truth to, like, you need to show up every day, but also like maybe try something a little bit new too. Like you need to be in the arena, but that doesn't mean you need to try to just do the same thing every single time.
Yeah, it's the balance of doing it for long enough that you can collect enough data to know what works and what doesn't, but also being open to changing things if you see that it doesn't work the way you want it to.
Something that's really important that we're kind of circling here is a willingness to self-experiment. Like you have to be willing to try things out to figure out what works for you. There is no, as much as I tried to make Atomic Habits a roadmap for building better habits, and as much as we hope to come across, examples of people doing whatever it is, the thing that you want to do, and be able to use or copy and paste their strategies onto your lifestyle, the truth is the only thing that really matters from any individual's perspective is, does it work for me? Does it work for the current situation or the circumstances that I'm facing? And the only way to figure that out is to be willing to experiment and try things out in your own situation. So it's all great to take in like the learning and to try to improve your strategy or have a better set of tools to apply to the situation. And that's the value that reading and research can provide, or talking to mentors. This can give you a better set of tools, but eventually, like, you're the only one who can swing the hammer. And so you have to be willing to try it out and see, like, hey, is this a good fit for what I'm facing?
Yeah, absolutely agree. So we have a first question from the audience, and a reminder to everyone, raise your hand if you have questions. It's not every day that you can directly ask the author your own questions after reading their book. So please do raise your hand if you have any questions for James. But first we'll hear from Randall. Go ahead, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, sure, thanks. James, I'm wondering, you mentioned these prior efforts that you had trying to figure out your kind of your creative thing, right? Which eventually became Atomic Habits. Was the other things that you tried, were they thematically similar? Were they like personal productivity? Were they whatever, or were they completely like disconnected and like like were you trying to start a band or become an artist or something?
Yeah, I am. A band is a great example because I have like zero musical skills, so that would definitely be a bit of a bad choice. I think it kind of depends on what stage of the process you're talking about. It's kind of like a funnel, where early on you're probably trying really broad stuff, and then gradually you get tighter and tighter, and you're still experimenting, but you're starting to like follow your nose a little bit, and the variance is maybe narrowing. Now it can still be useful even when you're in the tight part of the funnel to try something totally random and see. Sometimes you'll hear people describe experts as being T-shaped, where they have like a deep vertical of expertise and then they read broadly across very disparate and unrelated fields. And I think the key though is a lot of times people talk about like generalism and the importance of general knowledge and things like that. But the tall part of the T is just as important, to have like a deep specialty where you can apply your broad knowledge. That's what unlocks the value of reading broadly, of being a generalist. Otherwise, you're just kind of like an inch deep and a mile wide, and you don't really have much to apply it to. So to answer your question specifically, though, in my case, I never started out to be an author. I didn't know that I wanted to be an author. I didn't even really know that I liked writing that much. What I knew was that I wanted to be an entrepreneur and I wanted to be in control of my time. So the first 2 years, I tried all kinds of random stuff. I created an iPhone app. Well, I didn't create it. I hired some developers to create it, and it completely flopped. I bought a domain called puppypresent.com. I thought that I would connect with breeders and rent out time to play with their puppies. And you could like give it to somebody as like a birthday gift or a, whatever, something like that. I thought it was a good idea. The breeders hated it. They were like, wait, so you just want to come play with the dogs and never buy them or take them? I was like, yeah, exactly. And they were like, no, absolutely not. So I tried some stuff that was totally random. Then once I decided, hey, the reason that these business ideas aren't working is because I don't have an audience. So I kept reading about how you should build an email list and how you should like develop an audience. So I started a blog to build an email list. And this weird thing happened, which is as I started writing, I was like, you know what? I actually kind of like doing this part of it a little bit. And so I wrote about other stuff early on. I wrote about healthcare and I wrote about how to have better squat form in the gym. And I also wrote about habits and strategy and creativity. And what I realized was that whenever I wrote about those things, I got better feedback. When I wrote about the other stuff, it was kind of like, well, that's nice, but maybe keep it to yourself. And so the overlap of the Venn diagram of what I was interested in and what the audience was interested in were kind of those big picture principles about behavior change, performance improvement, productivity, creativity, decision-making. So that kind of stuff was just, those were the things that I liked and that the audience also liked. So I guess I experimented really broadly early on with business ideas, and then gradually I experimented with topics for writing, and then eventually it just got, more and more narrowly defined.
Thank you. Let's take another question from Jason, who's just disappeared.
Hey, James.
Oh, no, he's here.
Good to see you. We haven't caught up in a while.
Yeah,
but,
Jason, what's up, man? How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Great to see you on this salon. I had a question that is about this idea that you have that you want to be someone where people know your name, but they don't know what you look like your face, right? You don't have your
I'm about to turn off my
picture.
camera.
Right, exactly, exposed. But you don't have your face on your website. You used to at one point, and then you don't. And I'm wondering, and this is genuinely an interest of mine, but also with generative AI and with the fact that there's so much text that can now be generated that feels real and can be legitimately useful and intelligent. Do you feel that's changing the way you're approaching the content you create because you need to signal a greater sense of humanity? And obviously pictures aren't the only way to do that, but is there a sense that you have that you're changing because of things like that?
No, probably just because I'm too stupid to fully understand the tech, or am too behind the curve to have thought about it yet. But I don't know. I'm sure the AI will be able to generate, the photos for the website too, and the whole, like very humanistic feel on social media very soon if it can't do it already. I don't know. I'm not that worried about it right now. Maybe I should be, or maybe we all should be. It's this very interesting moment in time where it feels like maybe we're on the verge of something, but also it's felt like we've been on the verge of it for a while. So who knows? I don't think anybody knows for sure. I am really just focused on can I provide the most useful ideas to the audience? Can I do my best work and deliver something of value to the reader? And I'm trying to stay focused on that. But AI and many other things too will certainly, make the future very interesting. I also view it as kind of like a useful handicap, I don't share photos of myself on social media, partially just because I have no real interest in being well known. But also because there's nothing to hide behind. I have a really weird Instagram account. It's just text, and so my feeling is well, the ideas better be good because there's nothing else to pull people in. So there's no form of entertainment here. If this idea sucks, I might as well try to make it as good as possible. And so in that sense, it kind of puts a little bit of extra pressure on me to really deliver. And I miss the mark a lot, but I try each time. And I think if you have that kind of focus on providing something of value, then things tend to work out pretty well.
Yeah, I'll add to this that you start Atomic Habits with a personal story from your childhood, and even without knowing what you look like or seeing tons of photos of you on Instagram, I think there will still in the future be value in knowing that an actual human being has written the content of the book, has tried those strategies themselves, and has applied them, and that there is a part of actual human experience, especially in that area of personal growth and development, where you want to know that whatever you're reading about in those frameworks have been actually tested in the world by an actual human being, rather than written by an AI that hasn't applied them and where it may sound good, but hasn't been tried. What do you think, James?
Yeah, again, the only thing that the reader really cares about is like, does it work for me in my experience? So the ideas just need to be useful, but I do think there's some quality. People have really good BS meters as readers, like they can just kind of tell stuff. Morgan Housel has this great line where he says, writing for yourself is fun and it shows. Writing for others is work and it shows. And I always try to think about that. Like pretty much everything I write is a reminder to myself. My publisher had this good line when I was writing Atomic Habits. I kind of lamented to her that, the irony of me writing this book is upending all my personal habits. It's just becoming this all-consuming project. And she said, well, we write the books we need. And I felt like, yeah, that feels right. That's why I'm interested in the topic to begin with. Like I make all the same mistakes everybody else makes. It's like, have you ever procrastinated? Of course, all the time. Like, are you inconsistent? Do you focus too much on the goal and not enough on the system? Yeah, absolutely. Like, I make all the same mistakes that everybody else makes. And I think that because I've had to implement the ideas, I like had to build a writing habit to complete the book. I have exercise and strength training habits. I have nutrition habits. I've got habits in my business to run that successfully. And because I had to implement some of the ideas and like overcome my own flaws and mistakes, I can trust the material a little bit more. I just know that if it worked for me, it probably is going to be helpful for most people. So I do think there is some kernel of truth or element of usefulness that's somehow baked into the text, because the ideas were applied in real life. And I actually think bloggers can fall into this trap just as much as academics. Academics usually get criticized as like being in their ivory tower and not applying things in the real world. And, they miss the application of their ideas and all of that. But you can just as easily get in the habit of writing a blog post every week and just staying inside your house or your apartment and not really going anywhere and trying out the ideas. So to be a practitioner of the ideas and not just a writer of them, I think is an important quality to have. And I also think it makes the writing better.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely agree that people can tell when you've written something that sounds good, but that doesn't work, which is the case with lots of frameworks that you read about.
What else is surprising is so that's one problem, is it sounds good, but it doesn't work. Another problem is it sounds good, it might work, but you don't actually use it. Like you're not actually going to do that. It's surprising how often I get close to talking myself into writing about an idea that sounds good. And then I'll try to sit there just for a second and pause and be like, is this actually what you really do in your daily life? Like, is this actually what you really use? And if not, why not? Because there's something about an idea that sounds good and sounds sexy, but you don't actually use it. So what's the problem there? An example of this is, and I actually wrote, so early in my career, is probably, 8 or 9 years ago at this point, I wrote an article about the Eisenhower box, which sometimes you'll see it, is that like that 2x2 matrix of, urgent and important sort of stuff. And that's the kind of idea that sounds really good. It makes for a good blog post. It spreads well on social media. But how often have you used it really? Is it a strategy that you actually come back to every week? And if you don't, why not? And I think that's an even higher bar to try to set for yourself as a writer, because once you start to get going and you get an audience, yeah, of course you want to write something that people enjoy or that they're like, wow, it's a really smart idea, I should use that. But if they don't actually use it, if you don't actually use it, there's still something missing there. And so as best as possible, I try to focus on ideas that I actually apply in daily life. And I think that, hopefully will give people more actionable stuff that they'll use as well.
Yeah, this is a really good filter. We have 2 questions. Anna, you raised your hand first. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. James, I have this weird theory in life that a lot of people don't know what they want, right? They are looking for goals. And I always tell them, if you want to know what you want, watch yourself. This may be the craziest theory in the world, but I really believe that, if you're given 2 free hours on a Sunday, what are you really reading? What are you really writing about? Who are the people that you really want to call? This is often separate from who you think you will end up calling, what you think you will end up reading or writing. What do you think about this? Obviously, your book is about reaching goals. Have you encountered situations where people just started developing excellent habits to reach terrible goals? Or do you believe in kind of the Aristotelian framework where a good habit has a moral quality to itself, and if you employ good habits, then they will somehow purify or improve on your goals themselves?
Yeah, man, that's a big question. It's a good thing to consider too. How often do we inherit the goals and the desires of the people around us, or imitate the things that we see our peers doing, or follow the social pressures and nudges of our parents or of our coworkers or of society in general? I think this is something that influences our habits in a really big way. A lot of the time, it seems like people choose habits because they kind of feel like they're supposed to have that habit, not because they really want to have it themselves. And, in most areas of life, there may not be 1,000 ways to do something, but there's almost always more than one way. And so one of the first questions to ask yourself when you're picking out a new habit is like, which version of this habit am I genuinely excited about? What part of it, or what version of it is the most that naturally compelling or attractive to me? Like I like to lift weights. I like to work out in the gym, but not everybody wants to work out like a bodybuilder, and that's fine. Like you can kayak or rock climb or go cycling or for a run or 1,000 other things that could be part of living a healthy and active lifestyle. And you should choose the version of that habit that is most genuinely compelling to you. In a lot of ways, like the biggest hurdle, the first enormous hurdle to clear is, am I genuinely interested in this? Because if there's some quality of being pulled in naturally, you're going to find like endless ways to improve. You're just like kind of fascinated with it. So you'll always find different things to tweak or improve, or another way to approach it. If you aren't genuinely interested in it and you're just kind of doing it because you feel like you should, then even the obvious improvements are going to be a hassle. You're going to constantly feel like it's a chore to show up each day and to perform the habit. And so I think you can position yourself much better to follow through and to be consistent if you can be honest with yourself about what you're actually excited about. Your larger point about people not knowing what they want in life, or about, not being sure or not paying enough attention to where they direct their attention when they have free time or clear space. I think that's largely true. In my case, I feel like sometimes I'll get this inkling of like, oh man, like I'm just kind of fascinated with this, like I'm doing this and time is just clicking by. I don't even think about it. It's just kind of, where does your mind go when you have nothing to do, sort of thing. But I come up with stories for why I couldn't spend my day job doing that, or why I couldn't spend all day doing that. It's like I can't quite give myself permission to do the thing that I'm fascinated with, because it feels like, well, this would be too much fun. It wouldn't be work. So obviously that couldn't be a job. And this is something I have actually thought about my kids are really, really young, but when they grow up, or as they're growing up, this is something I really want to encourage with them, is to realize that anything can be a job now. And that doesn't mean that you can do it in any way. Like there's still realities of running a business that need to be addressed. And perhaps you need to think carefully about where you position yourself in that industry, or with that particular role or interest. But anything could become a job. And if you're genuinely excited about spending your days that way, then let's start to think creatively about how to design a life that could revolve around that. The example for myself is in my 20s, I was really interested in photography, and it started to become like kind of the impetus for me to travel. I had never traveled internationally until I was, I think 23 or something. And then over the next like 10 years, I went to like 40 countries and did a bunch of travel photography work. And like, I was trying to find whatever excuse I could to travel, even though I didn't really have any money. And I never did it professionally. I got some stuff published, and sometimes people would pay for some of the photos, but I could never get myself to get over this hurdle and be like, oh, well, this will be my job, because it just felt like this is too much fun. This couldn't be work. Like this couldn't be something I could make a career out of. And it's interesting looking back. I don't regret any of that now. I think I probably ended up choosing the right path for myself. And it was just like a thing that was good as a hobby for me. But I don't think that that story was true that I was telling myself. And I wonder how often we get in our own way with things like that. You know, I've gotten in my own way many times in life, but I try to generally not be my own roadblock. And so often in life, people talk themselves out of things before the world does. I mean, it's so rare to genuinely come up against a true hard stop in life where it's like, sorry, nothing else you could do. There's nobody else you could contact. You can't try a different line of attack. There's no other way that you could continue to pursue this path. It's just so rare that life will give you like a true hard stop. There's almost always something else, some other small step you could take, but people talk themselves out of it. And so it's almost always the case that you give up before the world forces you to give up. And you can't be like that with everything in life. You can't just, oh, I'll just continue to work on this forever because there's limited time and there are too many projects. But if it's something that's really important to you, man, I think it's really important to not be your own roadblock. And we come up with all sorts of narratives that can kind of cause that problem.
I love this. Only you can stop you, right? In some weird way. But it's so
I think that's generally true. It doesn't mean you can do everything or that everybody's talents are the same or anything like that. But it does mean that you're probably the choice internally to stop is probably the thing that ends up stopping the project. And if that's true, and it's a really important project, then maybe you need to sit with that for an extra second and think about what, you know, whether you should try it a different way.
I love it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's very counterintuitive. It took me years to figure out that I should do the stuff that brings me joy and that this can be a job and people will, you know, support me in doing that. It was completely counterintuitive. I don't know about the other people here in the room, but I was definitely raised in a way that made me think that you have to optimize for suffering. And if you're really suffering, then you will earn your success. Otherwise, I don't know, the lightning will strike you or something, like if you're having too much fun. And then you read, like, you know, your book, David Deutsch, how actually having fun and being in your zone of genius is the greatest competitive advantage you can have. If you have two people with equally good habits, equally good skills, and one is having tremendous amounts of fun and the other is hating it, then of course the person who's having fun and is doing this in their private time as well will be outcompeting the other.
It's interesting. It's hard. There is some kind of balance in there. One of the mantras that I kept telling myself when I was writing Atomic Habits, there's this Alain de Botton quote where he says, of many books, the reader thinks this could have been truly great if only the author was willing to suffer a little bit more. And so I kept telling myself that over and over again. For like 6 months straight, I'd wake up and I'd be like, you just need to suffer a little bit more and then it'll be good. That period, that like 6 to 9 month period that I had where I was working like 12 hours a day on the book and I go to sleep and I dream about it and then I wake up and I do it again. And like, I needed that period to get through it. And the project would not be what it was without it. But I really enjoy my career. I really enjoy my job and the topics that I write about. And so it's like both of those things are somehow true. You know, like it is true that I am doing what I like to do. And it's also true that that project had a period that was like a lot of suffering and hard work, and somehow they work together.
Yeah, it's the whole balance between we talked about consistency earlier, but a little bit of intensity is good as well. You don't necessarily want everything to just be easy and simple every day. There is something in the creative process where sometimes it is hard work. But as you said, and I think it's admirable that you managed to do it for 6 to 9 months doing that, right? But it's not something that you want to go on forever, right?
It probably also is a signal that I did actually like it in some way, because if you didn't like it and you were just doing it because you felt like you should, you wouldn't suffer like that for 9 months. You would give up after a week and you'd be like, this is dumb. And that's kind of the areas of life that you are well suited to. That's like the other side of the coin to ask yourself, which is, where is suffering easier for me than it is for other people? Or where is it easier for me to do the hard thing, the thing that other people seem to struggle with? I kind of can like work through that and it doesn't bother me as much. So it doesn't mean that you'll never work hard. You still need to work quite hard, but it just means that maybe because you enjoy it or because you're naturally suited to it, you can handle the pain of it a little bit better than most people might be able to. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to think about. I think it's also interesting to discuss, like, why do we do this to ourselves? You know, why do we convince ourselves that we need to suffer for it to be worthwhile? And there are all sorts of forces at play there. Like there's this huge force of status that's at play. You know, we have all these different, for a long time, the story, if you ask me, even early on. So when I, when I started my entrepreneurial career, so I went to undergrad, I went to grad school, and then I started my business right when I got out of grad school. And I was still so young that most people that were my age were early in their careers, or they were thinking about going back to school, or, you know, it was just kind of like that early 20s stage. And so if somebody asked me what I was doing, I would actually say, oh, well, I'm like studying for the MCAT. I'm like, you know, I'm working on this project. I'm prepping for medical school. And for the first, like, I still actually to this day, I have never shared an article from jamesclear.com on my Facebook, like my personal Facebook, where, you know, you've got your friends. Because I didn't want people who knew me in real life to like see the project early on. I thought like, oh, this will be kind of embarrassing, or they'll think like, oh, I thought he would do something different. He's like running this little blog, or like, I expected more out of him or whatever. And it's interesting to think about that collective we and this kind of like view that you have in your mind of what these people will think. Because if you were to ask me about any individual person, hey, are you worried about like what Sarah will think of this project? Like, well, no, like I'm not worried about what she's going to say. Like, she's pretty cool. She would be fine with it, So if you made it about an individual, I don't have that fear, but collectively, I'm somehow worried about what my Facebook friends would think of what I'm doing and how that would appear. And it's just because starting a blog is low status. It's like, to have a blog that nobody reads, who cares? Whereas going to med school, you'll always be praised for that. Like everybody would be like, oh, that's so awesome. I think there's actually a lot of really smart kids in college that don't really know what they want or haven't quite figured it out, which isn't a knock on them. Like, I didn't know what I wanted at that age either. But going to law school or med school is just such an easy default path where if you're smart, you'll be praised for it. And so many people find themselves going down that path, not necessarily because they genuinely want it or it's the naturally like the best fit for them, but just because they'll be praised for it and they're smart so they can figure it out. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't have doctors or lawyers. Like, obviously they're very important and it's great to have them. It's a tricky thing. And you can often find yourself 6 or 8 or 10 years down the line. You're like, man, I've been doing this for a decade. And like, I don't actually know if this is what I genuinely wanted. It's just that I was good enough at it that I find myself here. So thankfully I kind of avoided that pitfall, I guess, but it was partially because I was willing to be low status for a while that allowed me to now have a successful business.
And how would you recommend someone navigates that, whether they're maybe about to graduate from university soon, or they've maybe started on that default path already? Maybe they're in their first or second year of med school or law school, or maybe a little bit further. I know, for example, that for me, I used to work at Google, and leaving was very hard exactly for that as well. It was so easy to say, I work at Google. People were like, oh, I know what that is. That's great. And going from that to I write a newsletter online, same, like very, very different. So, how would you recommend someone explores that, maybe, faces that fear and takes the first steps towards exploring a path that is a bit different from the most obvious and high status one?
I mean, well, first of all, I wish I knew, but I don't know the answer. I think that, probably anytime you see somebody speaking like this, like me giving a talk here, a keynote on stage or whatever, like, you do need to have some healthy skepticism, be like, listen, these people are just humans too. They don't know what they're doing. Like they're just trying to figure it out too. But I think you need to at least have a mindset where you don't think it's a permanent decision. I sort of felt this pressure early on, you're getting ready to graduate and everybody's asking you what you're going to do next. And the conversation is somehow framed up like, what will your career be? And you think like, oh, I have to make this choice and it's going to set like the next 20 years of my life or 40 years of my life. But the truth is you choose your career every day. So none of these decisions are permanent. Like you can decide to change it whenever you want. So I think, hopefully young kids know that a little bit more, or young adults realize that a little bit more, where it's like, listen, this isn't fixed. You're allowed to adjust whenever you feel like you need to adjust. So just giving yourself permission for that. My dad has this line where he says, it's like three things. It's, I am free. I don't have to do anything. And I have time and space. And he was actually just telling me about that last night again. And he was like, look, it doesn't mean that you never have responsibilities, or you don't have to do anything. You're truly free. But so often all we think about is how fixed things are or how many responsibilities we have. And so even though it's not like universally always true, it can be very helpful to remind yourself, I'm free. I don't have to do anything. I have time and space. And I think it just puts you in a healthier mindset to maybe step back and think about some of those big picture issues. But the question that I would like to tell my 22-year-old self is, what season are you in right now? And then you can then maybe you worry less about the long-term thing. You're just like, hey, listen, given my current position, my current age, my current resources, the current skills I have, what's the best next step from here? And how can I, learn something about that? And then you take that action and you learn a little bit, and then you can revisit and ask yourself, what season am I in a year later or 2 years later? And so it's just it's a much more iterative process than I think I realized at the time. And I think that alone is probably, something helpful to keep in mind.
Nice. I really love the framing of seasons, and it's actually pretty relevant to the time we're at right now, because it's, the beginning of the year. I know a lot of people use this as a checkpoint, and I know that for many years, you've published, I don't know if you did it this year, I didn't check before our conversation, actually, if you published an annual review this year or not, but this is something you used to do. And so I'd just love to hear a little bit about, because obviously those are big questions and you can't go every day, waking up every morning, questioning everything about your life. So I feel like checkpoints like that for self-reflection are really helpful to know if you're going in the right direction or what season you're in. So what's your process at the moment when it comes to, thinking about the seasons and where you want to go, the direction and all of that when it comes to your life?
That's actually a really good point. I like the term checkpoints. Generally speaking, it's very hard to learn in life if you don't have feedback, and periods of reflection and review are chances to get feedback and to learn. But any job, any role, any life can seem like it's going poorly if you think about it too much, if you question it too much. And so you can talk yourself out of the value of anything if you just sit there and ruminate on it all the time. So it is probably true that you don't want to think about this every single day. Like you probably just need a period of execution where it's like, let me try this for a bit and then see where I am in a month or in 6 months. I sort of have 2 cycles of reflection and review. So I have a weekly review that I do. That's very business related. So it's, revenue, expenses, new email subscribers, conversion rates, like it's all stuff like that. And most weeks there isn't really anything to note about it. It's just more of the same. But then a couple times a year, it's like, hey, for the last 3 weeks, this hasn't looked that good, or, a little red flag goes up with something. And so that's just something that is a chance to course correct. And it's a check-in that usually looks the same, but tries to remind me to not let things get out of control or, to slip away from me. And then, as you mentioned, at the end of the year, I do an annual review. I did not publish it this year. I published them for the better part of a decade. And it was interesting because as I said earlier, I'm not really that interested in talking that much about my personal life. And it was almost always the most vulnerable or personal post of the year. And of course, readers liked it and found it useful, even though I don't want to share it. So, I kept doing it, but eventually I decided not to. But I would usually ask myself a couple big questions. So like, what went well this year? What didn't go so well this year? And the most important one I always thought was like, what are my core values and where am I not living up to those? So if you have like this assessment of your year, for me at least, there's a lot of measurement that's happening throughout the year, even if I don't think of it that way. So for example, my calendar, even though I don't think about it, it naturally measures how many cities I visited or how many nights I spent away from home, because it's just on the calendar that I was in Dallas from Tuesday to Thursday. And so I know that's a couple nights where I wasn't sleeping in my own bed. So at the end of the year for the review, I'll go through the calendar and add all those up and be like, how many nights away did I have? How many nights at home did I have? Does that feel right? Do I want to have more time with family? Do I want to travel more next year? Whatever. My workout journal, I write down each of my workouts like in a regular paper journal. And again, I have the date at the top of each one, so I don't think about it till the end of the year, but that's tracking how many workouts did I do, how many workouts per month, what was the average per month. So I just kind of like look back at stuff like that throughout during the annual review and get like an honest assessment of what I actually did that year. And then that third question is like, hey, what are the things that you say are your values? What are the things that you say are important to you? And are your habits lining up with those? And I think that's a really useful question to ask, which is, can my current habits carry me to my desired future? And if they can, then you're on a good trajectory and maybe all you need is patience. But if they can't, and there's some gap between the life you're currently living, the habits you currently have, and the values that you're trying to live by, or the type of person you're trying to be, well, obviously something needs to adjust. And periods of reflection and review are great for that kind of honesty, and you just realizing a little bit more about who you are and what you're actually doing and how you're actually showing up. Sometimes I'll ask myself the question in a different way. We're like, hey, what if like aliens came down and they looked at your life and they couldn't understand any of the words that you were saying? So they knew nothing about what you told yourself. They could only see your actions. What would they say your priorities are? And that's kind of interesting because we can, especially if you're smart, this is something I've learned is like smart people can talk themselves into so many mistakes. They're so good at coming up with stories for why they won't do something or why they haven't followed through on that project or why it's not the right time yet. They always have a really good justification for it. And it sounds very believable. But if the alien can't hear what you're saying, then it's kind of like, well, that's a good story, but I don't know what you're talking about. So how are you spending your time? Like, what are you actually directing your attention toward? And that level of brutal honesty is probably not necessary on a daily basis, but it is nice to have it every now and then and check in and course correct a little bit.
Yeah, I really like that because people tend to talk about values in a very abstract way, as if you have that list of values written somewhere in a notebook. And this is actually a very popular journaling prompt that you'll find online. What are your values? I like the idea that they're basically only the sum of your actions. The way you act, whatever you do, that's the way you live your values, not just writing them down and saying, that's my values.
Yeah, this is getting a little, maybe a slight tangent, but I have had this thought about values before, like, you don't really know your values until you have to choose between them. So it's very easy to have a set of values that, don't come in conflict with each other. And it's like, yeah, I value my career and I value my family and I value my health and fitness. It's like, okay, great. But like, what about when you have to choose your health and fitness over your career? Or when you have to choose your family over your career or the other way around? And, on most days, most people choose their career over their family. Like that's where they go and spend 8 hours or 10 hours. And they're not spending that much time with their family. Now it gets messy because in a roundabout way, you're choosing your family because you're trying to provide for them and, provide a house and food and all that type of stuff. But I think instead, maybe it's more useful to see it as like, their priorities that shift depending on, earlier we used the word season, maybe more useful in this case would be like moment, so like my son needs to get a little operation done, for example, on Friday. Well, obviously I'm choosing the value of family over my career on Friday. I canceled all my meetings. I scrapped everything. Now I have a free calendar day so I can go to the hospital with him. So that's one time when I have to choose that value over the others. But today on Wednesday, here I am on this call. And so it shifts based on the moment. I don't really know what like the compelling takeaway is from that, but I do think it's a truth about values that you don't really know them until you have to choose between them. And we often choose between them in different ways based on the moment. So on Friday, family is obviously the highest value for me. On Wednesday, there's a trade-off between family and career. And so your values shift depending on the moment. And I don't know exactly what to take away from that, but I do think there's something true about it.
Yes, not a takeaway, but a general theme that we're human, we're living beings, things change and we need to change with them and adapt basically. So, your days are going to look different depending on what the priorities are during that day. So We have actually quite a few people who raised their hands now for questions. So I'm going to go through a few of them.
Sure.
So the first one is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question. Where can I get one thing I've been struggling with is distractions. I've even tried to make a plan for distractions and all this kind of thing. And I really like your model in your book, the, create friction, make it harder,
Sure.
what's the reward and all. But I'm having some hard time coming up with examples of, well, how can I make it, obviously I've like moved things on got rid of things on my phone and all that kind of obvious stuff to try to make it harder to be distracted. But then there's the kind of internal cue, the internal desire to, because I know there is something there that will affect me, commitment wise. Or where can I find like examples of where it's harder to think of, um, for kind of in this area, harder to think of a cue to do something um, good and or that I want to do, and easier to think of, what would be a reward for not checking my text all till the end of the day or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. So it's a good question. There's some challenging things with implementing some of these habits. So one thing is, it's hard when you're doing there's like a habit of nothing, basically. So like a habit of not drinking alcohol, or a habit of not playing video games, a habit of not checking social media. It's very hard for behaviors like that to be rewarding because nothing's really happening if you do it. And so I think it's better to do one of two things: either focus on a good habit that occupies that space. So you kind of sort of like one plant crowding out another. You can try to crowd out the rain and sunlight from the bad habit by planting something more beneficial. For example, let's say somebody wanted to build the habit of not watching Netflix or not browsing Instagram as much, and they typically do that at 7:30 every night after dinner. Well, then maybe that's a time where you insert a new habit like working out or meditating or whatever it is. Just pick something that feels beneficial to you. By definition, if you are working out for that half hour, you're not mindlessly scrolling Instagram. So the good habit is crowded out the bad one. And maybe it doesn't necessarily solve the urge. Maybe you still like to check Instagram occasionally, but it's occupied that space. So that's an inversion from focusing on the bad habit, the thing you're trying to avoid, to one that could occupy that same space. The other thing is, sometimes you can layer on a benefit of not doing the thing that makes it more satisfying. So for example, I have a reader, I think I may mention this in Atomic Habits. He and his wife, they wanted to break the habit of going out to eat at restaurants so much. They wanted to stop eating out as much, and they wanted to cook more of their meals at home. Well, if they just don't go to their favorite restaurant, again, like that's kind of unfulfilling because nothing's happening. It's like not playing the video game or whatever. So instead, what they did was they created a little savings account and they labeled it trip to Europe. And then anytime they didn't go out to the restaurant, they took $25 or $50 or whatever the meal would have cost, and they put that in the savings account. And so now they had something satisfying that was happening in that moment. Hey, we didn't get the meal, but we do get the reminder and the dream of this vacation we're going to go on at the end of the year. So can you find some small way to make it satisfying in the moment so that you have some reward that you're feeling while you're there sitting with this feeling of not doing the thing that you were hoping to do? The other side of this, so that's on the backside, that's the reward. So that's after the habit's already occurred. The other side of it is the desire you have in the first place. And man, changing desires is really hard. Like, it's interesting to say, hey, you should just like not want a donut. It's like, well, I already know donuts taste good. So what am I going to do? Just like forget that, like you can't just like rewire your brain automatically. Now, occasionally you'll come across a situation where somebody has like an epiphany and they do think about it differently after that. So let's say, for example, you love donuts, but then you read this book that convinces you that carbs are the devil and grain is coming to get you, and you never want to eat a donut again. And now after you've read the book, if you do genuinely believe in what you just read, now you see a donut and you're like, oh, disgusting. Like, I don't want that. Like, that's not the kind of person I want to be. And so you have this like shift in the story that's going on in your mind. And at some level, to some degree, desires are just a story that we're telling ourselves about what that thing means. You know, the desire to eat a donut or to play video games or to smoke a cigarette is a story about how favorable that thing is and about the benefit that you'll get from it. So if you can shift that story, then maybe the desire doesn't arise. And even though that can happen, I don't know that you can bank on epiphanies. Like it's really hard to design it. It may be something that does actually occur in life, but I don't know that you're really in control of the process. So instead, I recommend identity-based habits. And actually, this connects to the question that I never answered from like an hour ago, which is what's the first thing that you want people to focus on, or what would you encourage people to focus on as the new year starts and they're trying to build new habits? I think the question I would encourage people to focus on is, who is the type of person you wish to become? What is the kind of identity you want to reinforce? And then which habits, which small actions can reinforce that identity? Can you find small ways to cast votes for being that kind of person? You know, this is one of the core ideas of Atomic Habits, which is every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And so you can't switch your desires overnight. You can't rapidly become this new person, or at least it's hard to design it that way. But you can take small actions that reinforce your desired identity. You can do something in the moment that casts a vote for being that kind of person. At some level, your habits are how you embody a particular identity. So when you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who's clean and organized. When you study biology for 20 minutes, you embody the identity of someone who is studious. When you shoot a basketball for 5 minutes, you embody the identity of someone who is a basketball player. And if you do it once, like you don't go out and shoot hoops for 5 minutes and think, oh, I'm a basketball player. But if you keep doing it every day, if you have this little habit where you go out and shoot free throws for a half hour, and then you do that for a month, and then 3 months, and then 6 months, and then a year, at some point you cross this like invisible threshold where you're like, hey, I guess being a basketball player is like kind of part of who I am. That's part of my identity. And I think that is ultimately where we're trying to get to with most of the strategies in Atomic Habits, is reinforcing the behavior enough, or doing the behavior enough to reinforce your desired identity, to have this kind of effect of cumulative actions shaping your beliefs about yourself. And if you do that enough and you start to take pride in being that kind of person, man, you really want to stick to the behavior once it's part of your story that you take pride in. You know, if you take pride in the size of your biceps, you never skip arm day at the gym, you know, or like if you take pride in how your hair looks, you have like this long, complicated hair care routine. You do it every day. And so the habits that are tied to our identity, the habits that are tied to these aspects of our story that we believe in and take pride in, they have a quality about them that's easier to do. Doesn't necessarily be perfect. It doesn't mean you'll be perfect with it, but the kind of person who views themselves as, I'm the type of person who, you know, I'm a runner. I don't miss workouts. Well, it's easier for them to go for a run than it is for somebody who's just getting started, because they're like, no, I'm a runner. Like, this is just part of what I do. And so I actually think that is the real reason, the true reason that habits matter, is that not because of like the results that habits will get you. We often talk about habits as like delivering these external results, like helping you get fit or reduce stress or make more money or be more productive. And habits can do that stuff. Like, that is true that they can do all that. But the real reason that habits matter is that they cast votes for your desired identity. They reinforce the kind of person that you wish to become. And so eventually your identity is kind of accumulated through your daily actions.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Couple more questions. Let's go with Lucas.
Hello. So I wanted to go back a little bit to something we discussed earlier about like the checkpoints in your life and having a review practice. And something that that I figured out is that I feel like doing a yearly review. That's like a good practice. But if you don't have a review practice that's a bit more like regular, I mean, obviously you can't question your whole life like every week, but I feel like doing something like every month or every quarter should be better, because like looking at a whole year, that's like a really long time, and it's like really hard to assess yourself over that long time frame, because you probably don't even remember everything, and you can only use those things where you, as you mentioned, where you collect the data about them. And I also feel that that there's a certain risk in thinking that okay, because I'm looking at this really long period, now I'm also making this change. I'm making the New Year's resolution, and now I want to change all these things at once for the new year. So something that I've been thinking about is to really try to establish this more regular review practice, because I feel like just doing it once a year, that isn't really helpful, and it's also like really hard to do. And I wanted to hear from you, James, what you think about this, and is there any specific reason why you are not doing it, or are you doing it maybe in some different way, but you wouldn't call it like a review?
Yep. Yeah, I can get behind all that. I think that's totally reasonable. Yeah, I probably do it in a different way, but just don't call it a formal review. It also depends on what stage I'm in, you know, like depending on where you're at or what you're working on, you may need those moments more than at other times. So one thing I did last summer, for example, was every day for like 2 weeks, I sat down. The first thing I did in the morning was I opened up a blank page in my notebook, and I asked myself, what are you really trying to accomplish? What are you really trying to achieve? And it's interesting how useful it can be to ask yourself the same question over and over. You would think that after like a day or two, you kind of get it and you're just sort of putting down the same thing. But I saw my answer really shift a lot over those 2 weeks. Things that I thought were the answer actually ended up just being like a middle step, and I could cut it out entirely. Other things that I thought were important to me were actually not something I wanted. They were kind of what we were talking about earlier, something my parents wanted, or my family wanted, or my peers wanted. And so by revisiting that and kind of like continuing to, you're just like sifting through layers of fog and trying to get to some solid ground eventually. So I would call that some sort of period of reflection review, even though that wasn't necessarily like some kind of formal process. I don't do it every day, but I did it for those couple weeks and it added some clarity. So yeah, I think the short answer is I can totally get behind doing it at a more frequent time frame or more frequent cadence. Really what matters is, does it work for you? You know, like there's no perfect time for everybody. It's just what makes the most sense for the project you're working on and the life you're trying to live. So yeah, I think that's totally reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, James, because we've been talking a lot about, habits that make sense to kind of stay the same, like to take care of your health, to running, like all of these kind of things. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your creative habits. There's something about creativity where I personally feel like, and a lot of people feel the same way, I think that you do need that kind of space for serendipitous discoveries to happen, to connect ideas in a way that cannot necessarily be designed in such a controlled way that you would want it to be for a habit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where for habits, as you said, environment, same place, same time, as consistent as possible, that's going to be to make it easy for you to stick to. So how do you implement creative habits in your daily life, especially because you're writing, you're creating all of this content, teaching people, etc.? What does it look like for you?
Yeah. So first of all, I think this is not just with creativity, but also just with habits in general. This is kind of a common, I know sometimes people think it's a criticism. I don't really consider it to be one, but they'll say something like, well, I don't want to pigeonhole myself, or like, what about being so robotic? You know, like I want to have spontaneity. I want to have space and freedom and creativity. Like, I don't want to feel so restricted. And, you know, my first reply is also, do you honestly know anyone like that? Like, do you honestly think this is going to be the problem, where you're like, you know what, I know that if I just get started with this habit, like I'm going to be so good, like I'll just be so consistent with it that I just am not going to slip up. I'm not going to have time to have this like spontaneity and creativity. Like I just am probably not going to make those mistakes. Like it's just not going to happen. But the other thing is, I think that these things are not conflicting. They're like reinforcing, you know, they can be mutually beneficial to each other. So it is often the case that the people with the worst habits actually have the least creativity and spontaneity and freedom. You know, the people with the worst financial habits feel like they never know where the next dollar is going to come from. The people with the worst reading and learning habits always feel like they're behind the curve. The people with the worst health and fitness habits never feel like they have enough energy. So it's actually by performing the habits consistently that you create the capacity and the ability to take advantage of some of the free time and space that might be available. Now, in terms of creativity specifically, there is some element of magic to it, some, muse or eureka moment or whatever you want to call it, where you can't predict it and ideas just kind of mash up and come together. And I think that's one of the most fun and exciting things about writing, is that every now and then you're just like, oh, you see this connection, you see this bridge between ideas that wasn't there before. And I always think that's the most fun thing for me to write or share with the readers, is to connect to things that were not previously connected and give people almost everything I write about is not new, like pretty much everything I'm sharing has been covered 1,000 times before. But my hope is that I can share it in a way where you're like, you know what? I never quite heard it put like that before. Or that gives me a different angle to think about this, or like a slightly different lens to look at that problem that I've seen 1,000 times. And maybe that different lens unlocks it in a way that wasn't unlocked previously. So in a lot of ways, I almost feel like those connections, those unexpected connections, that's where the real value lies in creativity, or at least in my kind of writing. But I still think that habits can help facilitate that. They can help it happen. So if you just sit there and you kind of wake up in the morning, you think, I hope I feel motivated to write today, or I hope I get struck with like a brilliant idea today, and you just wait around for it. It might happen occasionally, but it's just so rare. It's kind of like going into instead of going into the gym and working out 4 days a week, you're just like, well, I'll go to the gym when I feel like I have a day where I can hit a PR. And if I can put up, some kind of personal record today, then great. I'll show up. And it's like, well, you'll never put one up then, because you don't have the training and the capacity to actually move more weight. So you need some element of consistency, some element of showing up to kind of get the juices flowing and to create the ability for things to connect. I had this weird moment that happened when I was writing my newsletter. So the first version I wrote, like I said earlier, every Monday and Thursday. I did that for 3 years. And at one point along the way, about 2 years in, my email list got to 100,000 people. And I had this, little moment where I got in my head about it. And once it got to 100,000, it was like this big round number. And I was like, well, now I really need to try hard, because a lot of people are paying attention. What I should have been telling myself in retrospect was, keep doing what you're doing, because this is working really well. But instead, I felt like I needed to do it better or do something new at that point. And so what I did was I spent more time writing, and I thought, okay, if I've been spending 20 hours on the articles, now I need to spend 25. And our writing actually got worse. And the reason is because, and I didn't realize it for a couple months, but I really need reading in addition to writing. Like almost every good idea that you have, almost every idea that you have is downstream from something you consume. It's so rare to have a thought that's like truly spontaneous. It's almost always, I was listening to James on a Zoom call and that prompted a thought for me. Or I was talking to my mom in conversation and she said something and that made me think something else. Or I was browsing the Twitter feed and I saw a tweet and that sparked a thought for an article. It's always as a response to something that comes in. And so you really need to make sure you have good information flows, good inputs, so that you can get good outputs. And when I stopped reading as much and just tried to only write so that it would be better, the inputs got shut off. It was like turning off the hose. And so the outputs got worse. And now I view it more like driving a car, where reading is like going to the gas station and filling the car up with gas. And writing is like driving and going on an adventure. And the point of having a car is not just to park it at the gas station and fill it up with gas all day. It's not just about consuming over and over again and researching endlessly, but you also just can't drive forever, because then you run out of gas on the side of the road. And so you need this balance of reading and writing. You need this balance of consumption and inspiration, and then execution and publishing and shipping. And it's actually this like dance between the two that leads to these creative connections and this more creative output. And so we could say that having a reading habit and having a writing habit are essential in that way for creativity and spontaneity and generating interesting ideas. Some people are more structured with it than others. You know, some people will sit down and write at 9 a.m. every morning, and other people are just like, you know, I can't stop myself. I write every day, but I never have a set time for it, and there's no schedule, and, you know, I sleep until noon. And so it can be wow. Sorry.
Yeah, this is no, that's fine. I'll jump in while you catch your breath. But I think this is very powerful, even beyond just writing and reading, because we tend to focus a lot on the productivity aspect, the producing, what is the product, and we sometimes forget that any kind of product needs materials, needs fuel to happen. And so you can expand what you were saying to almost everything you do in life. For writing, your input is reading, but if you want to be a good partner for you know, for your wife or for your husband, you also probably need to have the fuel of good mental health, enough energy to be present. If you want to be a good teacher, you also need to have those inputs in terms of what's the right way to teach that information, what's the way to engage, etc. What are the right skills to develop? So I think just keeping in mind every time you're trying to produce something, to create an output, thinking about what are the inputs that I need to make that happen in the way that makes sense.
That's a great framing. It's a really good question. What are the inputs that I need to generate the output that I want? And I actually think this is something for any creative. I know there are a lot of creatives on this call. This is something you probably should spend more time on. It's like probably one of those things that's endlessly undervalued, which is how do I create better information flows for myself? As I said, almost every thought you have is downstream from what you consume. And so if you want better, more creative, more useful, more interesting thoughts, then you need better, more creative, more useful, more interesting inputs. And finding better sources of information, crafting better natural flows of information is a really high leverage activity for anybody who gets paid for the quality of their ideas. And so if you can come up with a better way to do that, if you can come up with the internet has so many ideas on it, you know, it's this endless well. And if you can somehow filter the signal from the noise better than most people, you're going to be in a position to have much better outputs.
Yes. Anna, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Actually, now I want to say two things. One is Simon Didio, the physicist, has this amazing paper on Charles Darwin's reading habits. And he shows from like 1832, 1837, like when he was working on the barnacles, how at the beginning Darwin is, and we have his entire reading journal of his entire life of Charles Darwin. Like we know what he read, and we have access to those texts. And they basically use AI and show how at the beginning, when Darwin's thinking was very much aligned with his era, he was reading things that had just been published. So things that everybody else was reading at the same time. And as his thinking becomes more original to the point of utter sacrilege and changing the course of science and religion forever, it starts, like the distribution starts going insane. And at the end, like 1860, when he finally cracks it and he's like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, then he's reading all over the place. He's reading the antiquity, he's reading medieval texts, he's reading completely different things from his contemporaries, which I find absolutely fantastic. And I just wanted to add a note to the creativity question, which to me is very, very close actually to the environment question, which is the role of your family and relationships in your habits. You know, when we talk about like Thomas Mann for like decades, woke up in Munich every morning and, you know, wrote for 4 hours starting at 5 a.m. and wrote thousands of pages in his life. Yeah, but he had like his entire family was like complicit in this. Like he was literally the CEO of his home and everybody took part in his habits. And I always encourage people in our community to just ask for that space from your loved ones. Like if you need people to just be quiet for a moment, either ask them to be that, or you be quiet for somebody else, or get an office, start hot desking, go somewhere else. Yeah,
it's a crucial point. You know, our our habits are tightly tied to the groups that we're a part of. And we're all part of multiple tribes. Sometimes the tribes are small and tight, like your family. Sometimes they're big, like the company you work for or the community you live in. And they all have an influence on the behaviors that are like normal and natural there. And that's why one of my kind of takeaways in Atomic Habits is you want to join groups where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. Because if it's normal in that group, it's going to be much more attractive and natural for you to stick to it. You're kind of like, you have the wind at your back rather than a headwind. And sometimes finding groups like that is kind of ready-made. If you want to start doing yoga, well, great. There are a bunch of yoga studios and you can go be around people there who your desired behavior is the normal behavior for them. Sometimes you got to create those groups on your own, whether it's a reading group or like one of the most useful things that I did was I didn't have any entrepreneurs in my family and I didn't have any authors that I knew or like were in my family or anything. So after a year or two, I started hosting these retreats where I would get like 6 or 8 other authors together and we would all just rent an Airbnb and get together for 3 or 4 days and talk about that. I hadn't published a book yet, but most of them had. And, what is it like to publish a book? How do you pick a title? How do you build your audience? How do you build an email list? Like all these things that an author would be interested in. And almost without fail, those 2 or 3 days were like some of the most powerful, useful days of my whole year. And then I have to go back for 6 months and execute on all of it. And it was just because I created that space where I was around people where my desired behavior is a normal behavior. So sometimes the benefit is, as you're saying, Anna, asking, your family to just be quiet for a little bit and give you space. Sometimes it's seeking out a group that already has the habits that you want to have. But in both those cases, you need your social environment to support the habits that you're trying to cultivate.
Thank you. There's been a general theme of taking the time to learn and to reflect and then go ahead and go and do it. And it's almost the end of this amazing conversation where we've learned a lot. So I encourage everyone to take everything we've learned about habits, about flexible consistency, about values, about your identity, and go and apply it. And I know Anna is going to host a little after party. So James, thank you so much. And I'll just give the floor back to Anna to tell you a little bit more about that. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Anne-Laure also, thank you and happy birthday. We're doing a little Discord after party in the Interact forum. So those of you who are members, come. Those of you who are not members, become members and come. James, this has been incredible and I've learned so much. And I'm like, can I go on a run now? And it's kind of night here, so probably not. But I'm sure everybody's going to do something really useful after this conversation. Thank you so much. We will. Is it okay if we share the video and some photos? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. Appreciate you sharing some of your time with me. I know time is precious, so thanks for stopping by. I hope you found some of it useful. Obviously, Atomic Habits is there as a reference guide if you want to dive into it more. And just wishing you all a happy new year. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year. Take care, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you, Anne-Laure.